The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to Trans Advocacy Network's webinar on model employer policies for transgender employees. My name is Anand Kalra, and I'm the Trans Advocacy Network Program Coordinator. I'm going to hand over now to Katie Stewart, who will be our host for today.
Hello, this is Katie Stewart, and I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us today. We look forward to a great conversation, and hopefully everyone learns a little bit more. Let's go to the next slide. So to start off with, our purpose here is to share some best practices regarding transgender employee policies in diverse workplaces. We encourage you to ask questions, and we'll get a little bit into how to do that on the next slide. But to begin with, if we could go through just some general housekeeping. For the most part, everyone's mics will be muted except for the presenters. And we'll go through how to ask questions here in a second. After the housekeeping, we'll have some introductions. We'll go over model employment policies with our wonderful guest speaker, Matt Wood from Transgender Law Center, including making your case and what to cover, and then some time for Q&A. Next slide, please.
Looks like we're just having a momentary freeze up here. Let me check on what the problem is.
Okay. So basically, to ask a question during this webinar, your interface from GoToWebinar should have a little chat box. Just enter your text in that chat box. You can specify who you want to go to, whether you want it to go to just the organizers and panelists or the whole audience. Just use that. And to ask an audio question, if you are using your call-in number, which is what's preferred because the computer mic is a little unreliable on this technology, click the raise hand button, and our organizer will see you and will call you as soon as time is available. And please remember there's some time for questions at the end as well, so if you can write a question down and save it for later, that would work out greatly. But at the same time, if you've got that question that needs to be asked right away, please do. So a little bit in the way of introductions. The Trans Advocacy Network is an alliance of transgender organizations working at the state and local level, coming together to build a stronger trans movement by facilitating the sharing of resources, best practices, and organizing strategies. Basically, we see ourselves as building the infrastructure of the transgender movement here in America. Our website is transadvocacynetwork.org, and we're also on Facebook. Just type in Trans Advocacy Network in that little Facebook bar, and you will find us. We'd love for your organization to apply to be a member today. You can do that through our website at transadvocacynetwork.org. So I'm your facilitator for this webinar. My name is Katie Stewart. I'm on the TAN Steering Committee as the co-chair. I'm also the Executive Director of Transgender Education Network of Texas.
And like I said before, my name is Anand Kalra. I'm the TAN Program Administrator, and I work at Transgender Law Center.
And I'm Matt Wood. I'm a staff attorney here at the Transgender Law Center, and I will be talking to you today about best practices and creating policies for an inclusive transgender workplace.
We'd like to know a little bit about who's on the call today, so I'm going to put up our fancy polls, and you should be able to click your response in. So firstly, where are you from? Okay, looks like everyone's had a chance to answer. And it looks like things are pretty split between big cities, medium cities, and small towns. For the second question, I will open that up now. And looks like everyone had a chance to answer that one. 2/3 of us have said yes, our employer does have a non-discrimination policy, and 1/3 of us have said no. I imagine that might be biased towards those of us who are working at trans organizations right now. And finally, for the third question, does your state prohibit discrimination based upon gender identity and expression? Okay, and looks like people had a chance for that one. And sadly, 100% of people said no, that their state does not prohibit discrimination based on gender identity and expression. So,
okay, thanks for that, Anand. Appreciate the poll here. It's good to know a little bit about the people we're going to be talking to today. As I said, my name is Matt Wood, and I'm a staff attorney with the Transgender Law Center. What I want to talk about right now is model policies and best practices, sort of what they are and why they're needed. Best practices are basically the best ways for employers to prevent discrimination and harassment in the workplace based on gender identity. Model policies are a way of memorializing these best practices, making available to other employees and to clients as well as to the transgender staff. To do that, and to think about why model policies are necessary, we start thinking about the way we would like to see the world. And in an ideal world, there would be laws prohibiting discrimination and harassment in employment based upon gender identity and expression. And of course, employers would listen to their transgender employees and clients and adapt to meet our workplace needs. Employers would also enact policies and have best practices for transgender employees, and they'd think about them, and they'd hold their employers accountable for them. So how can we help create this world? Well, the good news is that there are already laws prohibiting employment discrimination based upon gender identity and expression. That means that there are explicitly laws in 8 states, as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, where there are laws prohibiting employment discrimination based upon gender identity, and in some instances on gender expression as well. So what that means is that there's a state law, and among those lists of protected categories, so veteran status and sex and race and immigration status, it would say something like discrimination is prohibited on the basis of someone's gender identity, and in California it says gender expression as well. And that's a very powerful tool for people. Under federal law as well, the federal statute is Title VII, and it prohibits discrimination in employment based upon sex. Now, in that statute, it doesn't say the words gender identity or gender expression. However, the EEOC, that is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has decided that sex includes gender identity and sex stereotyping. And so really that is in probably the last 5 to 10 years, there have been a number of cases where courts as well have held that the term sex as it's made in that federal statute include those other issues as well. So that's our issues of gender identity. And also what's called sex stereotyping. That's similar to what we call gender expression in California. And really what it means is that it is unlawful to require someone to conform with a stereotype about sex. So whether someone is masculine enough or feminine enough based on stereotypical notions of genders. So if you have an employee and you force them to conform to those different categories, that can be actionable in some states and under federal law as well. Now the caveat is that certain employees, for that law to hold forth, there needs to be a minimum number of employees, and under federal law it's 15 employees. So, and different states have different levels as well. A number of cities and counties also have laws prohibiting employment discrimination based upon gender identity and expression, and the number of those is growing every year. Right now it's currently at a little bit more than 150. So that's the good news. On the other hand, despite this good news, there's what we all know is a gap between the promise of the law and the lived reality of people's lives. What do we mean about the gap? We all know that even though there are laws out there protecting people from discrimination on a number of bases in the workplace, that people continue to be discriminated against. There's been a number of studies in the past 5 or 10 years showing that transgender people face enormous amounts of discrimination in the workplace. In 2011, NCTE and the task force released a study called Injustice at Every Turn, where it showed that more than 90% of transgender people either experienced workplace discrimination and harassment or took actions like hiding to avoid it. That's an astounding number, 90%. A few years earlier, in 2008, the Transgender Law Center conducted its own study of the state of California and found that 67% of people experienced workplace harassment directly related to their gender identity. So even in states where there are laws prohibiting this kind of discrimination, it's still a fact of life for many, many people. Another reason for this gap between the promise of the law and the reality of people's lives is that law is really remedial. That means it's responsive. It comes into play after the fact when someone basically takes legal action because they've become discriminated against. Now what we're going to talk about today is ways that employees and employers can be proactive. That is, how before an act of discrimination occurs, how can we prevent it? And of course the way we're going to talk about that today is about creating best practices and policies so that employers are really aware of their obligation not to discriminate and to create safe and welcoming workplaces.
Hey, Matt, we had a question come in.
I love questions.
Wonderful. So the question is, can the EEOC's Title VII ruling change with a new presidential administration?
No, it cannot. It is established. It can't be undone by a presidential directive or anything like that. That's a great question, though. So let's talk about creating policies and practices. So the first step is to really develop a plan. By that we mean help employers listen to your needs. Remember, we identified that as one of the ideal things people would need. So developing a plan is really creating a blueprint to change workplace culture so that it's more inclusive of transgender and gender nonconforming employees. What are some things that people are going to need to build their plan? Well, they're going to need a team of allies. Really, the future of transgender rights in America is non-transgender people. There are just so many more people who are non-transgender than who identify as gender non-conforming or transgender. So it's really important to have allies to help us, people who may fall on the LGBT spectrum or just be supportive allies in some other way. So identifying those folks who can help us make best practices and who can help us implement policies to really safeguard our rights in the workplace. That often means identifying the folks within your organization that have the power to make change. You hear them called stakeholders sometimes, you hear them called management team or leadership, but they're really the people who are empowered to make high-level decisions about the kind of work the organization does and the kind of work it does internally to safeguard people's rights and to make them more productive and happier in the workplace. So usually a good place to start with that is HR, human resources, if your company has one. So maybe there's a supportive person, maybe you have a one-person HR department, or maybe you have a large one, but identify someone in there who can be your liaison, someone you can go to right off the bat that you feel comfortable both being out as transgender to and talking about this need and why it's important for the workplace. Also identify what's been referred to here as champions in the administration who can help. Usually every organization has one or two people who are very, very supportive and pleased to be an employee of the company. And they really work to help everyone make a general climate of respect that recognizes the contributions of everyone in that workplace. So identify who those stakeholders and helpful people are. Another thing to do is to make a clear request for assistance. A lot of times people want to share how they feel about being transgender or how they feel about being discriminated against or harassed or how they fear about their fears for those things in the workplace. And that's great. It's good that you have someone that you can talk to in the workplace about that, But a better idea is to be able to have a specific request. So it's going to be, hey, human resources person, or hey, person in management, I'm a transgender employee, and I am concerned that we don't have an explicit policy prohibiting discrimination in my workplace, or some kind of practice so that I know how to change my name on my W-2 or all my documents here. Can you help me? So it's a good idea to be thinking about a specific request that you have. It's even greater if you know the answer to that as well, and you can suggest it when you make the request. I've had employers who've said to me, don't bring me a problem without bringing me the answer. But sometimes really you are the expert and the HR person doesn't know the answer, so you can provide it to them as well. It's also really important that you know your rights in advance of asking the HR person or the other decision maker, because a lot of times they're going to say to you, I'm not sure about this, I need to go check into it. And it's really helpful if you can say, I would like you to specifically have a policy that says that I can dress as the gender I identify as within our dress code. And the reason why that's important is because that's protected under federal and state law. And I want to be able to, be myself in the organization, and I want you to follow your legal obligations here. So you should know your rights. If you don't know them, you should reach out to us at Transgender Law Center so we can help you understand them. And then another good idea for developing your plan is to follow through. Sometimes people make the request and then they're scared or they get really busy. And so they don't follow up, and they think because they haven't heard back from someone that the person is ignoring them or it's fallen through the cracks. There's an expression that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And unfortunately, sometimes that is true. And by that I mean that the persistent employee who in a good-natured, respectful way sends emails that say, Dear HR person, I'm following up on the conversation we had earlier this month where you were going to look into ways to make our organization more transgender friendly, perhaps by creating policies and practices to help transitioning employees access the restroom or change name tags or something like that. I'm hoping that we can have a meeting later this week to discuss it so I can find out if we're up to date on it. I know that's a lot of information, and that's why we call it a plan, so that's only the first step. So let's be a little bit more specific and drill down here to the other steps of the plan. As I said, that was a lot of information, so it's a good idea to prioritize. And by that I mean identify the areas of greatest need and think amongst them which ones you think are the most important. Do you need a new policy, or do you need to update an existing policy? Most workplaces already have lots of policies in place. They may have one, for example, that prohibits, and they should, sexual harassment and discrimination. But they've never thought about what that policy might look like when it's applied to gender identity harassment or to same-sex harassment. So it's a good idea to think of updating that policy to include, let's say, examples about what would anti-transgender discrimination and harassment look like. So if there are any examples in the policy, it says, this company prohibits discrimination and harassment based on gender identity. An example of harassment is when a coworker repeatedly and intentionally calls a transgender coworker by their previous name or by incorrect gender pronouns. If you do that, we will administer progressive discipline or something along those lines. Or also that says, maybe denying someone access to the restroom that they identify as when they've requested it can be actionable as a form of harassment. So if there is already, and that would be an example, say, of a new policy. So there's lots of policies, and think about which ones need to be updated and which ones just need to be brand new. Another example of one needing to be updated is maybe about name change. Lots of employers already have such policies for people who may, for example, get married and be changing their name. But they haven't considered how that works when someone is changing it because they're changing their gender identity. So that's another great example of one that's similar. And then here we list some potential topics. In addition to the ones I just discussed about dress codes and facilities and discrimination and harassment, maybe there needs to be some updating or some explicit policies about health benefits. It's great if employers offer insurance policies that don't have explicit exclusions based on transgender status or gender transition. A number of states now have what are called insurance bulletins that provide insurers with guidelines and also consumers saying that these kinds of exclusions are per se unlawful. That means they're specifically unlawful right off the bat if they are seeking to deny transgender people specifically the same care that non-transgender people get. But unfortunately, a lot of those plans are still lawful in many, many states in the U.S. So to the extent that you can advocate for inclusive benefits within your organization, that's a great policy or practice to highlight. And you know, not a lot of insurers understand our unique health needs. This may not even be on their radar until we bring it up. And a lot of times it's very challenging. It could be embarrassing to say, you know, my health needs may be different than other employees. A lot of times we have the exact same ones, but our health needs are related to gender transition as well as just our general health benefits. But, you know, it takes some risk in having these forthright conversations with people in HR or people who are your bosses if you're not used to it. But it's certainly a good thing to do. And then a last policy is sort of a bigger one, and it's about transitioning on the job. So there may be people who come to their job already as their gender identity, and they just want to safeguard that they won't be discriminated against. And then people who are actually changing their gender identity and transitioning while they've already started the job, they may need additional policies and protections to ensure that they feel comfortable and protected in the workforce being themselves. And then a third step is understanding why these policy goals are needed to begin with. They help, you know, when you're talking about policies, sometimes you start thinking by what do I need, and then how can that be met by a policy? And then finally, what would be the goal of the policy? Policies cannot necessarily change minds. As an aggregate, they can. That means that once there are more policies that are supportive of transgender people and they seem like the norm because they're included with lots of other policies, it can create for people just the perception that this is nothing new, that it's the way the workplace has always functioned, and for employees who are hired on after the manuals and the policies are in place, they may not ever know that anything was ever different to begin with. But someone who already works there, a policy change can be very, very new and affirmative for them. But it's good to think about what you're trying to change with a goal. And a lot of times what you're trying to change is the practical way that business is conducted in that workplace and the way that transgender employees are treated. You're trying to make them treated better, or you're trying to create an employment environment where we just feel more comfortable to be ourselves and to be highly achieving, productive employees where we can live our authentic lives. So one way that policy goals do that is by providing employers with knowledge of their legal obligation for creating safe and productive workplaces. I can say in California that when the law was recently clarified such that among the list of protected categories, gender identity and gender expression were made more clear, by that means they were explicitly included in the law using those phrases, and that meant that when the posters came out every year that said, know your rights as a California employee, you know, those posters that are usually in the break room or by the water coolers, it can be incredibly affirmative as a transgender employee to look up there to the poster and to see that those categories are included in there, to know that you have rights and that everybody has to respect them. And so I think that a lot of times this is important for employers to provide good policies so that transgender employees know that they are coming to a workplace or that they already are in a safe workplace where their dignity and respect is valued. And also those posters provide employers and the policies provide employers with the concrete knowledge that they have to apply by the law, and this is what the law means. In addition, they provide coworkers with information. It's good that employers are on notice that transgender people have rights, but it's also important for coworkers to be able to know their obligations. And sometimes it's actually the employer who has to tell the coworker, you can no longer treat the employee that way, or I'm putting you on notice that I am watching out for this employee and I don't like the way you're treating them. So policies are great because they provide clear guidance for everyone as to how to behave in the workplace, what is expected in very specific situations. Policies are also important because they provide a pathway for recourse at work. What does that mean? Well, it tells you what's going to happen if someone violates the policies. Sometimes you see policies and it just says you shouldn't discriminate. But that doesn't tell the employee what they do if they have a coworker who continues to call them by the wrong pronouns, or they have a manager at a remote office place who says, You can change your gender, you can change your name, but I'm not going to allow you to use the men's or women's restroom, and there's nothing you can do about it. So the policy will set out in there that if a person is harassed, they must first bring it to the attention of their manager in a written complaint, and that written complaint will be responded to within 15 days or something like that. So some way for affirming that there is a complaint process in play, and then it will be followed. So it's not enough to just state what the policy is. You have to have, or a good one states in there, what happens if it's not followed? What's the recourse? Is pay docked? Is someone going to be suspended? We call that a policy of progressive discipline. So it gives everyone a notice that, this type of behavior won't be acceptable, and that if you continue to do it, something very bad like termination could happen. On the other hand, it's important to know your limits. In most cases, policies are not the same thing as legal protections, so they're not legally binding. If someone violates your workplace policy, they can't go to civil court and file, a civil complaint against an employee, because a policy, while it may be an important index to show that the company is following the law or intends to follow the law, if the policy itself is broken, it's not exactly the same thing. I mean, the judge and a jury can't enforce your workplace policy. They can only enforce the law. And that's another good reason to have your policies mirror the law. What are some other things the policies should include? Well, just the basic things that transgender people think about when they're transitioning, but maybe aren't yet on the radar for employers. Things like name changes and identification. It's particularly important for transgender people because some people want to try out a name before deciding that that's going to be their new name. Some people may have a court order system available where they live in their county or their state that allows them to change their name by a court order process. Some people have administered processes, and other people would have what's called a common law name change process. So it's a really good way to outline in the policy what it takes to be called the name you want to be at your job. Here at Transgender Law Center, we always advocate that an employer not base a name change policy on having some kind of legal documentation. That means you and I shouldn't have to go to court right off the bat and get a legal name change or a court order just to be respected as the name that we choose to go by. Another policy may be about pronoun usage. When someone talks to their, it's a good idea for a policy to reflect a person's decision to affirmatively come out as transgender and to inform their supervisor or their manager that on this day I'm going to start coming to work as male and I want to be referred to as Matt. And on that day I want people to use, starting henceforth, I want them to use he when referring to me or his or sir pronouns. So it's good for policies to include not just name changes and identification, but also policies about pronoun usage. Another really important policy to have is regarding employee privacy. In some ways, our transgender status is absolutely our protected medical information. Not every transgender person, but some transgender people choose to use various forms of medical care in order to help our external presentation of ourselves match our internal sense of self. And if we choose to do that, and if we choose to have health leave in order to access that health care, that's not something we want discussed with our coworkers, right? We don't want someone to say that Anand or Matt is going out on medical leave to have some sort of gender transition procedure, and we don't want that discussed among our coworkers. We also don't need to have new employees informed of the fact that we used to be a different gender than we are now. So it's great to have some kind of employee policy that addresses privacy issues. Just like you wouldn't talk about other important information about people's medical status, whether they're a cancer survivor or had a miscarriage or something really, really fundamentally personal about them, that's also related to their bodily autonomy. We don't talk about that. We don't have gossip of that sort in the workplace. And so it's good to safeguard employees' privacy that way. That may also include policies about record storage and who gets to see an employee's, folder. That may be something that only lives in the HR department. You don't necessarily need to have a form that may reveal your birth gender on it with your manager. That may be something that could just live in HR. So that's another good policy to have. And then, of course, one that people most frequently contact us about is about restroom access. Unequivocally, transgender people should have the right to access the restroom of their gender identity if they so desire. Sometimes it's a good idea to have a policy that allows for flexibility because not all transgender people want to have access to the restroom exclusively of their gender identity when they transition. Some people might like a little bit more restroom privacy, say, at the beginning of their transition. And in fact, all employees should have more privacy and should have a gender-neutral restroom available if they so desire it. So that could be another policy to have in there. Dress codes, sex-segregated job assignments. The policies can explain and interpret at what point should an employee have access to those particular jobs that are sex-segregated or be allowed to comport with the dress code of a particular gender. And again, we always think that the person should have that access to the ones that affirm their gender autonomy without having to have any kind of medical treatment in order to be recognized as the gender they say they are. Health insurance access, we just discussed about. And then one sometimes that people don't think about when they create policies and practices, identifying and removing barriers to hiring. Sometimes there's a committee at work, a group of people who are charged with reaching out and finding new hires, or maybe having interns or volunteers. When that group meets, they probably put together a plan for how they're going to, broaden their search. Maybe there's a diversity committee at work. So maybe it's a good idea to have a policy and practice there about how you can affirmatively try and recruit more transgender or gender nonconforming people for the workplace. Because a great way to show respect for diversity in a workplace is to actually have diversity in a workplace, particularly along the lines of gender identity and gender expression. What do I mean when I talk about sample policies? I don't have time to explain all the different policies that a company could choose to have, but let's talk just about a basic non-discrimination policy here. A great start for a non-discrimination policy is one that clearly states the non-discrimination law of the state, jurisdiction, and the federal law where that person lives and works. Federal law is sort of the baseline for law, and it says, as I mentioned before with Title VII, that companies shouldn't discriminate on the basis of sex. And then, as I said before, a number of circuit courts and the EEOC have interpreted sex as including gender identity and expression. But it would be great to see in a policy that, protected categories, prohibited forms of discrimination include sex and gender identity and expression. Much as the way that some policies say pregnancy. Pregnancy discrimination is a form of sex discrimination. And so a lot of employers have included the word pregnancy in their policies. So when you talk to your employer, you're not really asking them to reinvent the world. What you're saying, reinvent the wheel. Sorry. You're asking them to do what they might have already done with other categories. It's simply elaborate upon what discrimination based on sex means. And here it means harassment or disparate treatment based upon gender identity and expression. So, specifically include those terms. And then I said, give examples of prohibited conduct. Like, what does that look like? You'd be surprised the number, or maybe not, the number of employees or managers who don't understand how humiliating, demeaning, and infuriating it is to be intentionally called by the wrong pronoun over and over again by a coworker who's unsupportive or just mean. I've seen and I've received calls from people who say that they work in a call center, and every time a colleague transfers the phone, he'll say, "Oh, now I'm going to transfer you to her, him," or someone who carefully switches between your old name, Matt, Mary, or something like that, in a way that's just a form of harassment. It's a way of signaling to the transgender employee over and over again that a coworker doesn't agree with their gender transition, is unsupportive, and wants everyone to know that. And that's simply intolerable in a workplace. So that could be an example of prohibited conduct. Another one would be, say, refusing restroom access to someone. And it could say underneath this policy, prohibits discrimination based on gender identity, including denial of restroom access or using incorrect pronouns, something like that. A non-discrimination policy also ideally includes a clear outline of a complaint process. And that is, as I mentioned before, a process that tells someone, what do you do when someone discriminates or harasses me? Where do I go? Who do I tell first? And how do I do it to hold them accountable? It's good if a company has a policy of progressive discipline. And that may mean that a first offense is the person gets written up. Or a second offense would be a conversation with the manager and a higher-up person. And a third defense could be, being docked of pay or being terminated. However the company wants to outline it so it's incremental. And the reason progressive discipline is so important is because you could have a manager or an employer who is somewhat, unfortunately, sympathetic to the harasser and may feel like, oh, that harasser is a single parent, or they've had a rough time getting a job, and just for this one time, I don't want to fire them, right? And so by having a policy of progressive discipline that forces them to be accountable and to put that bias aside and to hold that person accountable incrementally, and it makes absolutely clear then that this person has numerous times harassed or discriminated against you. Another good policy would be to have regular training that addresses gender identity and expression specifically. And what I mean by that is sometimes companies are forced by their insurer to carry, liability insurance for, say, sexual harassment of customers or coworkers. And so they have sort of a trainer come in, and that person is like, you should not inappropriately touch customers or say sexist things or, ask personal questions or date someone who's your supervisor. I mean, that's all good guidance, but what you want to see in there is something that addresses gender identity and expression. And that could be, as I just mentioned, the pronoun misusage or the restroom denial, intentional acts that are, based upon gender identity and gender expression. And then another great policy, for example, for someone to have, for a company to have, would be a policy for transitioning employees. You'd be surprised, again, the number of employers who don't think they have transgender employees, don't really think that transgender employees work in their field, and are surprised when they meet an employee who informs them that they are changing genders and that they want to know what the workplace policies and procedures are for informing their coworkers or their clients if they interface with clients or vendors. And a lot of times I see HR or the boss or the manager say, gee, we don't have any. I don't know, let me get back to you. And then they stall for weeks. And in the meantime, the transgender employee is kind of left hanging. They don't know what, they should do. Should they tell their coworkers? Should they go out on their own and inform vendors? They don't want to misstep. And that's often what the employer doesn't want to do. The employer doesn't want to do anything wrong, and so they stall. And so when I talk to companies about having policies, sometimes I use words that they understand, like diminishing liability. And what that means is, helping you not get sued, helping you think about ways not to violate the law unintentionally. And so it's good to have a policy in place, even if you think you're never going to use it. And so policies for transitioning employees include important things like, how do you tell the transgender coworker, the transgender employee's coworkers and clients? Maybe the transgender employee wants them to do it themselves. Maybe they want the manager to step in. Maybe they want to do it remotely by email. Maybe they want a meeting. Maybe they don't want to be present at the meeting. So it's a good idea to think about a policy for that. It's also good to have a policy about name change, particularly when so many companies' emails are based on first name. I know that my email at Transgender Law Center is Matt@Transgender Law Center. So my first name, which is gendered, is right there on my email. And if I'm changing gender, I don't want to be using my wrong name on my email. And I don't want my boss to lose any business by people sending something to the wrong email. So that's a great policy to have as well. At what time should someone change their email? And what should be required for that? Similarly, name tags or uniforms. And then also important information like how to change name and gender if necessary on employee records such as payroll, health insurance, or computer information systems. Those are all really important sources of workplace information, of client and of employee safety, and also for productivity. You don't want to lose any clients or yourself lose any credit for the work you're doing because there's some kind of glitch between your identity tracking information at work and then the clients you serve. And then finally, of course, restroom access. Always an important one for transitioning employees, and usually the number one thing that the employer asks about. Employers sometimes ask if they can maintain a gender-neutral restroom, and the answer to that is yes, absolutely. But the transgender employee should not be forced to use that restroom. That restroom should be available for anyone else who needs additional privacy, or in the case of an unsupportive coworker, if they don't want to use the restroom of the transgender employee, then they can go to the private gender-neutral restroom wherever it's located in your building. So transgender people shouldn't be forced to use the gender-neutral restroom, and certainly not to use the restroom of the gender they don't identify as. A key thing for policies for transitioning employees is flexibility. Now, sometimes employers don't like to hear that, right? They're making a policy because they don't want to treat people differently. Because when you treat people differently, there's a danger that you can discriminate against them. And so the ways that you pitch this to employers is not that we're treating people differently, but that we're being flexible because people have unique needs when they transition. And also because transitioning can be a long process for some people. And that's regardless of whether medical intervention is used or healthcare is used. Some people take a long time coming out, and they want to go slowly and inform coworkers and clients sort of only on a need-to-know basis. Some people have transitioned before they work and never want to tell people. And so you want to have ways to safeguard those different stages that people are at. So there's no one way to transition. So it's great to include language that an employee may request reasonable accommodations as necessary. So that doesn't lock the employee into saying, I want to use this restroom right off the bat. If they don't want to. If they do, great. But it also allows them the flexibility to go incrementally and not to be penalized for dressing as their authentic self one day and then maybe the next day dressing as their birth self. Doing so doesn't mean that someone is any less sincere about their transition at all. It could just be the steps they're taking as they live out their gender transition. So those are just a few of the possible policies that, and practices that employers and employees should consider. It's not exhaustive. There are a lot of places online where you can go for help and to find resources. You can, of course, always contact me at the Transgender Law Center. But here are some other resources that you can use. A good one is the model employment policy we have up online there. It includes these topics as well as many others. Another great set of guidelines that are incredibly comprehensive are those offered by the U.S. government. So the federal government has a gender identity guidance policy. The federal government is the largest employer in the United States, and so when they issue guidelines for how they want their agencies to treat transgender and gender nonconforming employees, super important and really influential for private employers as well. They see that the government is doing it this way. It provides them with what they think of as legitimate guidance. And so that's another great source of information. And then finally, the HRC has a coming out guide for transgender people in the workplace, and it includes not so much policies, but language about how you can talk about these topics with your employer, because sometimes it's awkward, and you want to be able to use language that they understand. I sometimes use the phrase non-transgender because I can find the language cisgender really confusing to employers. And they're like, what does that mean? You're asking them to use all sorts of words or understand all sorts of things that they may not be familiar with. They may not understand the difference between gender identity and expression or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, cisgender. And so there's some language in there that can be helpful. It's not exhaustive, and really the best language and the best policy is the one that works for you. It's the one that addresses the issues that are important to you, that make it safe for you in the workplace to live up to your full capability, and that actually protect the employer as well. It helps them understand their obligations so that they can treat everyone with dignity and respect. One thing about workplaces is that lots of different people work there, and it requires a common level of dignity and respect. What that means is people should check their bias on the door. Just as you wouldn't say, I can discriminate against you or I don't like who you are because of something about you, you don't do that in a workplace. We all have a level of dignity and respect where we check any bias we have sort of at the door in order to do our jobs. And what this really does is create a system of accountability and safety so that employees and employers can feel safe going about doing their work. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions they want to text into Anand for me right now?
We'll give folks a few minutes to formulate their questions if you've got them. In the meantime, Katie, I think you said one had come into you.
Yes. Matt, if you could comment on, so the understanding is that HIPAA would cover employers would prevent employers from divulging medical information. Can you make a comment on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, HIPAA isn't designed for employers. HIPAA is the, help me out with here, the...
it's healthcare
Privacy
The
something Act. I don't know what the
Act, yeah. Normally I know that, I'm blanking on it. But in any case, it only covers healthcare providers. So it doesn't affect employers. It can be an important statement to talk to employers about your HIPAA rights, but it's not actually actionable. That means a private employer can't be held liable under HIPAA, that is, for revealing your private health information. And that's unfortunate, right? Because sometimes employees do share what health procedures they're going out for, say, family leave or medical leave with their employers. They're not always required to do so, but to the extent that in some circumstances they are, that provides coworkers, employers with knowledge about their intimate health conditions. So employers can be held liable for releasing that information under other laws, other discrimination laws, and other privacy laws, but not specifically under HIPAA, unfortunately. However, if your health provider, if you go to a community clinic, or if your health provider is friends with your boss and says, oh, say I saw Katie or Anand or Matt last night and they were here for hormone therapy, did you know they're transgender? That could be actionable because that person would be revealing your health privacy as a provider. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Sure.
So it looks like we have a pretty quiet group out there. We'll give folks just a couple more minutes to ask any questions that you have. In the meantime, I have a question, Matt. Which is...
Again.
Yes, me again. That's me. So I really appreciate the way you laid out the content on your slides. And I think it looks really nice and neat and clear on the paper. And I'm wondering if you have any insights about kind of the messiness that comes up when people try to put these kind of policies into practice, and maybe challenges that people have faced and suggestions you have for those common pitfalls.
Yeah, people, as I said, use these policies and practices at different times in their transition and different times in their employment. We know as job seekers, the first thing we look at is, we go to the website of the company and we look under About Us. And unfortunately, there's no tab that says, we discriminate on these bases. So it's really good for someone to maybe have a statement online that says, our non-discrimination policy. And it can be really short there. And that's the one that's good to mirror the state law or the federal law with some enhancements, particularly that enhancement about sex, including gender identity and expression where relevant. As I said, just as you would for pregnancy status. But, when someone who's a company has an employment handbook and they hand it out to new employees and they require them to sign it, in some places and under some types of law and in some situations, that handbook can create a contract. Not all the time, but sometimes in the right circumstances. And so that's a really good place to have good contract language. Because, if it's not in the law, in the contract, sometimes it's hard to infer the meaning of it. When I'm selling you my house, I want to put everything, not that I have a house, but if I'm selling it to you and I want to put in there everything that's included, it includes appliances and access to this easement for my special driveway or something like that. And if it's not in there, you may not know that it's included. And so my point being that an employment handbook should be very specific. And to the extent that you have a committee at work on, lifestyle or enhancing employee happiness or, revisiting policies every 5 years, that's a good place to get more specific. And as I said, it's good to bring to the employer not just the policy, but the goal of it and the reasons why. And if you really want to become super helpful, you can show them the language and show them where it would go in the handbook or the policy. Employers can justifiably be freaked out by employee, transgender or not, who presents them with a single-spaced, multi-page document that covers every aspect of transition and says, here, adopt this. Because an employer's first thought is going to be, whoa, 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 we don't need all this. We're a good company. What have we ever done? And so incrementally it can be helpful. And that's why those first conversations are so important. Hi, HR. My name is Matt. I'm a transgender employee here. You may not have known that. I love working here, but I'm concerned because it doesn't say in our family leave policy that I can take health leave for gender transition surgery, and I want to make sure that that's included and that you know that. So when you redraft the policy, or maybe it's time to update it, or something like that, pointing out where something that exists can be improved is a good step as opposed to starting from scratch. But one case that is good to start from scratch is with that non-discrimination policy, particularly getting it online so people can see that. Is that helpful?
It is. Thank you.
Great. You know, that said, people shouldn't be afraid of bringing those single-space documents to their employers. If they work in a place where there's no policy whatsoever and they really want to start a conversation about having one and they don't even know where to begin and the employer can't even imagine what such a conversation or policy could include, it's a great idea to download that model policy that Transgender Law Center has and say, here's an example of what a policy might include. Why don't we discuss together the ones that are important here? And then you can just hand it to them.
Thank you. So it looks like we don't have any more questions. If you think of more questions that you have, you're welcome to contact me, and I can pass them on to Matt. My email address is anand, A-N-A-N-D, @transgenderlawcenter.org, and it should be in your registration confirmation email as well. So with that, Katie will give us the wrap-up. Matt, if you could move to the next slide, please.
Thank you.
So thank you again, Matt, for giving us such great information to work with and carry forward to the work we do at the state and local level. It's very appreciated. If anyone would like to know more about Trans Advocacy Network, please visit our website at www.transadvocacynetwork.org. And this webinar was made in part possible by the Gill Foundation, so we'd like to give a shout out and thank you to them for helping us put this on for you. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.
Thanks, everybody.